Greetings, and welcome to today's webinar entitled Before and After Ransomware, Preparedness and Recovery. This is hosted by Conversational Geek, provider of free online books for IT professionals. You can get those at conversationalgeek.com, and it's sponsored by Veeam, provider of solutions to ensure availability for the always-on enterprise. My name is J. Peter Brzezzi. I'll be your host, your master of ceremonies, so to speak, if webinars had such an illustrious position, and I believe they should. You know, when it comes to the world of security, one of the scariest things a company can get hit with is a ransomware attack. I've seen it reduce IT professionals to tears because they weren't prepared for it. I've seen IT professionals set up Bitcoin accounts so that they can pay the ransom rather than prepare to battle it properly. Well, that has to end. Through today's webinar, you will learn the dangers of ransomware and how to mitigate those dangers properly. Let me introduce your speakers for today. For starters, we have Orlando Scott Cowley. He's a cybersecurity expert with a ton of experience working in the field of security for nearly 15 years. And we have Rick Vanover, Microsoft MVP and Director of Technical Product Marketing and Evangelism for Veeam Software. Folks, keep in mind, we'll be taking questions toward the end, and I'll be moderating those, so please remember to use the Q&A feature. If we aren't able to answer your questions during the webinar itself, we'll make sure that we get back to you in an email. And without further ado, we'd like to welcome Orlando to take it away.
Thanks, J. Peter. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for taking the time to join us today. What I'd like to do is lay out before you exactly what ransomware is, how it might affect you, where it's come from as well, and some of the history behind ransomware. You may have come across it, you may have experienced it, you have my sympathies if you have. But if ransomware is new to you, then today you should learn something, and you should be able to take something back to your organizations this afternoon. It's been all over the news recently. You can't have failed to miss it, and we'll touch on some of the big highlights and some of the really good ransomware that's out there. And I've got to say early on that ransomware has become the de facto threat for today's enterprise organizations, and I'll hopefully help you understand why that is a little bit later on as well. So it's not a new threat by any stretch of the imagination, but it's relatively new to lots of people right now. You could be suffering an attack right at the moment. Your IT team might be trying to unravel the aftermath of a ransomware attack, but it's actually been around since about 1989. And in fact, the very first ransomware Trojan was something called the AIDS Trojan, which was delivered on a 5¼ inch floppy disk. If you remember those, you've been in IT longer than I have. I remember them at school, but it was delivered at the World Health Organization AIDS conference by someone who was essentially trying to extort about $189 out of people. It wasn't really effective. It was very quickly stamped on and very easy to get round. Now, today, the story is completely different. Ransomware has become, as I said, the most effective piece of malware in the cyber criminals' arsenal, and it's a billion-dollar crime. The FBI called it a billion-dollar crime last year. In 2016, we know that in the first quarter, about $209 million was paid in ransoms over about 30 million attacks in the US, whereas in Q4, that 30 million attacks had jumped up to 260 million attacks. And this is mostly due, in fact, wholly due to the success of the attack. If this is all new to you, then feel free to go and do some background reading. You'll find lots of these phrases and words I'm using today are ones that will describe in a beautiful detail how ransomware works as well. One of the most recent and most scary is ransomware as a service. And this has popped up in the last few years, because of the success of ransomware, but also because of the ways ransomware is driven. Now, we've moved on from the days of cybercrime and cybersecurity when we used to talk about people looking for notoriety or looking for column inches in newspapers and publications. Now, these attacks are driven by organized crime gangs across the world. They are there to generate money, and that money is laundered back into the underworld and the organized crime world. So it funds the darkest parts of humanity. Ransomware as a service is effectively a byproduct of the success of ransomware. It's essentially made ransomware accessible, it's cheap, it's easy, and thanks to the ubiquity and anonymity of Bitcoin, now ransomware has become one of the main ways cyber criminals will generate money. What you'll find is, and what we've seen over, I'd say, the last 5 years or so, is the complexity and the skill and the elegance of the way these pieces of software are written has moved on dramatically, and the way they're managed and supported has as well. So often these organized crime gangs will have customer service teams, they'll have call centers, they will handle the calls, inbound calls from victims in such a good way that it's very easy for you to pay the ransom. And they do that because they know that customer service is important, and they know that making it easy for you to pay the ransom means that you'll pay the ransom. There's a very good and well-documented example now of Lansing Board of Water and Light in Michigan. Those guys admitted, I think about a year ago, April 2016, to paying $24,000 in a ransom, which on the face of it isn't significant for a large organization, but what they later revealed also was that the attack actually cost them about $2.4 million in total once they'd recovered and once they'd cleaned up afterwards. So there's always a cost associated with ransomware, even if you pay the ransom. And $2.4 million is a much bigger chunk of cash than 24,000. So thinking that, you know, we're fine, we've got the right products in the right place, we've got a good antivirus system in place, isn't all of the protection that you're going to need, and that's what we'll come on to today. Now, in the early days, ransomware was easy to deal with. We used to talk about locker malware, and this would just lock your PC. It wouldn't do anything other than just lock the screen. And very often it would be some sort of law enforcement agency that were claiming this, the FBI usually, or your local state police. It was a con trick, basically, and it was there to get you to pay money just to unlock your computer. And there were lots of easy ways around that, and those attacks were fairly simple. What we see now is that this is much more about extortion, and it's to trick you into paying the ransom. And the business model for this and the proof of concept for this really was built through the fake antivirus systems that used to pop up probably about 5 to 10 years ago. You may well remember these, you may well have been affected by one. Fake antivirus was a very convincing alert. There's one on the screen there, which shows you or tells you that you've got a virus and that you have to pay to be able to remove that virus. And again, this was just a con trick. It was just extortion. There's one affiliate network who used to distribute fake antivirus was reported a few years ago of making $158,000 a week in revenue through this type of attack. And again, it wasn't there to deny service or to plant malware on your computer. It was just a trick, a clever con trick that would trick you into paying not necessarily a ransom, but an extortion fee. Now we see a completely different ballgame. Ransomware, in today's form, has become the poster child for malware. In fact, the majority of Windows-based malware that you see has ransomware attached to it in one form or another. As I said earlier, the FBI last year told us that ransomware was $1 billion business. So you can imagine what their total addressable market is if they're generating $1 billion through this. A lot of us chase markets that are a lot smaller than $1 billion. So there's a lot of money to be made here, and there have been some massive successes in the ransomware attacks. I'll cover these off later, but CryptoWall is one notable example. The most recent one, which was taken over recently, is Cerber. That's a very effective piece of ransomware, which is causing a lot of pain for people right now. And those are examples of what we call crypto malware. So they've moved on essentially from just locking your PC or trying to extort money out of you to actually doing something with your files, your hard drive, your connected network drives, and making it very hard for you to recover unless you pay the ransom. Now this is where ransomware really ups its game and really becomes a significant threat for organizations, because there are many ways that it can spread. Most of the attacks you see today are driven through ransomware as a service platforms. As I mentioned earlier, those are the byproduct of cybercrime gangs who've been writing this code for many years now and have decided that it's very easy for them to stand up a platform, a lot like a cloud solution or a software as a service platform, that is a cybercrime platform. It's there to allow criminals to send these attacks to email addresses, to corporations and individuals around the world for a very small fee. And in fact, what we've seen is that ransomware as a service is so successful, it's actually taking, in some cases, classic crime like car crime and drugs and burglary off the streets, because the risk for criminals is dramatically reduced when it comes to using a ransomware as a service platform. If you're looking for one, they're hidden on the parts of the web we call the dark web. The media will talk about the dark web in lots of fantastic ways, but to security professionals, it's just a corner of the internet that you need some additional tools to be able to access. It's very easy to do. I wouldn't recommend you do it at work or with your work PC, but accessing platforms like ransomware as a service is relatively easy to do, and you can generate your own malware, you can buy a support contract, you can get support 24/7 for your malware, and you can send off the attack, and in theory you can make some cash from it. Now, the problem that we have, or we've had for the past few years, is ransomware has got so advanced that it now becomes very hard to undo the damage that it does. Encryption has been used in those attacks for quite a few years now, and it used to be very simple encryption or very weak implementations of encryption. So we've run up against problems where cyber criminals are using better encryption than some of our banking institutions. So trying to crack that code is almost impossible. So we have to look for other ways to try and get around those problems. One good example is the CryptoLocker ransomware, which I mentioned earlier on. In about 2014, that was taken down by an international law enforcement network operation called Operation Tovar, and it was run through the Game Over Zeus botnet, which you may well have heard of. It was a botnet that contained over about 1 million infected endpoints, and of that million, about 25% of those were in the US. And that was taken down in 2014, but very quickly replaced. But what we found with CryptoLocker was that once we'd gotten into that botnet, we could effectively remove the encryption keys for CryptoLocker and build a decryption tool to allow people to recover their data. But that's not always true. Sadly, the encryption today that's used by ransomware like Locky or Cerber is much stronger and much better. We're talking about RSA grade encryption, AES encryption. The type of encryption your bank uses, 256-bit AES with 2048-bit RSA keys. It's not going to be worth your while trying to reverse engineer that, and that's why we have to talk about preparedness and protection as we do today. Now, sadly, it's not just, or we used to just talk about ransomware in the sense that it was just Windows PCs that were at fault. Unfortunately, that's no longer the case. Android devices can be affected. Smart TVs can be affected. In fact, that's a picture of a TV, which is a smart TV, which has been infected by ransomware. And even those of you who are watching this webinar on a Mac and thinking, I've got a Mac, I'm fine. We don't get viruses. Unfortunately, you do. There is an OS X or a piece of ransomware that supports OS X called KeyRanger. That's the first of many that's coming down the pipe, but that's distributed through a BitTorrent client. And it quite happily circumvents Apple's security software checks that exist in OS X as well. So that list there is a very short list, but it shows you the ingenuity and the effectiveness and the resourcefulness of the cyber criminals. They're trying to essentially lock up more and more devices. Now, sadly, once someone is infected by ransomware, what we found is that it will or very early on, sort of 5 years ago, it would encrypt a very small number of files, usually Office-based files, and you could recover most of those from backup fairly easily. That list then grew and grew and grew, and now we see ransomware that encrypts the entire hard drive, the master boot record, ransomware that goes looking for network drives, any connected network drives you might have, it will go and encrypt those as well. And also ransomware that looks for cloud connected drives too. So if you have any cloud services that map as a drive onto your desktop or your OS, then ransomware goes after those as well. So it's getting much better at what it does, and I think that's only going to get worse. The budgets these guys have available to them are significant, and I'll come back to that in a second. Now, how does it get in, and how do your users, or if you've been affected or infected by it, how does that happen? Well, a lot of this is down to social engineering. You'll be familiar with the way social engineering works in email-based attacks, and even things like phishing, voice phishing, or SMS phishing. There's usually some kind of hook which is baited to ensure that your user falls for the trick. And email is the most common way this is perpetrated these days, and the cyber criminals have moved on to employing native English speakers. The ransomware comes in several different languages. In fact, Locky, which was very recently one of the most dominant forms of ransomware, comes in 30 different languages, all the way through to things like Vietnamese. So the cybercrime gangs are employing native language speakers to write A, the code, but B, also the attacks, so the emails that these attacks are sent with. And what you'll find is that they've learned it's very easy to exploit a human being. And it's much easier to do that from afar with an email than it is to try and perpetrate some sort of network-based attack or some kind of hardcore hacking attack, which requires learning of code and learning of vulnerabilities in systems. Now that still goes on, but the large volume attacks that we see on the internet are all there basically to try and target individuals inside the organizations. Now, lots of these look like a fairly basic and elaborate con. You'll see things like invoices which claim to be for services that your organization has had. In a large organization, that's fairly common. In a finance department, which is who these guys go after, they're receiving invoices every day. So clicking on the attachment, which contains the dropper for the ransomware, again, is very common, very easy to do, and that's one of the big ways people get affected. But also what we find is that it's not necessarily always such an elaborate con. It's sometimes a very specifically targeted attack, to the point I'd actually call it espionage tradecraft. That we know that cybercrime gangs use pieces of malware called remote access Trojans, and those will sit resident inside an organization. In fact, if you look at the lots of the reporting that's released, we know that attacks sit inside organizations for about a year sometimes, or sorry, half a year before they're detected. And that frightens the life out of me, and it should do for anyone who runs a network. But what they're doing during that time is they're looking to assess, the cyber criminals are looking to assess the value and the worth of the organization as a target, and what type of attack could they send into that organization. So if they have found, for example, that the malware they're using, or the Trojan they're using, is resident on someone in the finance department, they could potentially try a business email compromise attack or a whaling attack and try and trick that person into wire transferring a lot of cash to an offshore account somewhere, pretending to be the CFO or the CEO. That's a whole different ball game, which I'll come on to later. If they're in the HR department, for example, then again, another trick we've seen is asking for the entire organization's W-2s. So you've got all of the identities of the people inside the organization. Now that, as I said earlier, it feels a lot like cyber espionage because they're taking their time. It's not a very quick attack. It takes several months to perpetrate, and they're working out what's the best way to hit the organization. Where can we make the most money out of this? So we've got to try and find a way to deal with that. Now, if it turns out that you're not particularly valuable, or you're perhaps an end user, a consumer, then it's very easy for them just to drop a piece of ransomware onto your machine. And the first you know about it is probably a few hours later after the attack, when you get a pop-up like this, and this is the message from the Cerber ransomware, which is the most common at the moment. What you'll see is that it tells you your documents and photos have been encrypted. Very often it will give you a time frame, like there's the clock at the bottom of this screenshot, and you then have to pay in Bitcoin to get your data recovered. And as I mentioned earlier, the anonymity of Bitcoin makes it very easy for cyber criminals to launder that money, to take money from you. And as Jay Peter said at the beginning, some people have just set up a Bitcoin account and paid the ransom because they feel like it's the easiest thing to do. Ransomware doesn't really give you much option, because what it will do is, in lots of cases where you don't pay, your data stays encrypted. And some of it will even start deleting the data as well if you don't pay within a certain time frame. So they kind of make it very hard for you to hunt around and look for decryption tools, or try and reverse engineer the malware, which you're never going to do essentially. So they make it very easy for you to pay, and they also encourage you. They put the pressure on. They put a timer on there to make sure that you really are concentrating on what they want you to do, which is basically pay the money. Is what it boils down to. Now, what do you do? Well, I'll come onto that in a second, but before we do that, I want to just touch on some of the successful ransomware campaigns over the last few years. These have all been successful for different reasons, and they all show really how the attack has moved on, how the malware has moved on, and how it's become a much bigger problem for organizations. CryptoLocker there, the one at the top, as I mentioned, was taken down in 2014. It was part of, or taken down as part of Optovar, as I mentioned earlier on. It was distributed by the Game Over Zeus botnet. And this was really before, I suppose ransomware as a service was only really starting around about 2013, thereabouts. So this was when you could go buy a botnet. You could rent a botnet. Even before ransomware as a service was around, you could, as a cyber criminal or a budding cyber criminal, you could go and rent botnet time. And the botnet herder would charge you $50 for 500,000 machines and a large distribution list of email addresses. And you could do with those what you liked. And lots of people send spam or phishing attacks through those botnets. CryptoLocker was the really where ransomware started to get bad for organizations. Luckily, through Optovar, and when the botnet was taken down, as I mentioned earlier, we got the encryption keys out of that botnet. Some other examples of finding encryption keys are around. Normally what you'd find is there's weak encryption as well, so the decryption key was written into the malware in some early cases, but as I mentioned, the cyber criminals are learning as they go. Now CryptoWall, the next one up, again is a poster child for this type of attack. It was a pivotal moment in the way ransomware was written. CryptoWall 2, and there have been lots of different iterations of this particular piece of malware. CryptoWall 2 was fairly quickly squashed by the security community, but within 48 hours, CryptoWall 3 was rewritten from a brand new code base. I'm going to let that sink in for a minute. A brand new code base from version 2 to version 3 in 48 hours. Now, there are lots of agile development teams around the planet, but there are very few that can turn that kind of code around very quickly. And these are not trivial pieces of software. They're quite complex. What they do is quite complex. Their implementations of encryption are quite complex. So to come up with a brand new version in 48 hours from having your code effectively squashed by the security community is significant. CryptoWall 3 also is said to have earned the attackers about $350 million. So when you put those two figures together, you can see how they managed to turn that code around so quickly, because they've got a huge R&D budget. They've got $350 million IT budget. And there's not many organizations that have that sort of size or IT budget that are defending themselves effectively against ransomware. The next one down, Locky, is the one you've probably heard of. It's the one that's been the most common, the most dominant for the last few months or so. It's the one that introduced us all to macros as well, malicious macros in Word files and Excel files. I'll come on to those later. And this is also the one, as I mentioned, contains 30 different languages, so it can be used in any country pretty much. Now, Petya is, again, a step change for ransomware. This is where we move on from just having a few files encrypted to having our entire hard drive encrypted, and where the Bitcoin demands start going up and up and up and up. So that's something that's not around so much now, but it was the first piece of ransomware that had encrypted your entire hard drive, and we've seen that evolve as well recently with JavaScript-only ransomware or fileless ransomware appear, which encrypts your disk through a JavaScript applet as well. And then lastly, Cerber, which is the one that we're all talking about right now, is in fact, Malwarebytes told us in their 2017 threat report that it makes up about 90% of the Windows ransomware attacks around at the moment, knocking Locky down to only about 2%. So it's really taken over. We speculate as to why it's taken over, but I would say it's probably due to the ubiquity of ransomware as a service, and also because the authors of Cerber are able to update the ransomware very quickly, and they're constantly pushing new updates out to it. So where an antivirus firm detects Cerber and provides a signature or a patch for it, or a fingerprint for it, the authors are then circumventing that very, very quickly. Incidentally, Locky, we'll go back to for a second, I should have mentioned, written in 30 different languages, yes, but also we suspect, and in fact the intelligence tells us that there's only a small team of people that write that particular piece of malware, possibly 2 or 3 people. So they're either getting help from somewhere, but when you're able to push out code that quickly, as Server proves, you're very agile because you've got such a, I guess, such a big IT budget. Now, sadly, it's not. The news doesn't get much better just yet. Ransomware used to be the preserve of financial organizations. We used to talk about banking Trojans. We used to talk about financial services being the big target for this kind of attack. What we know now is that it's affecting everybody. And as I mentioned, there are hints of cyber espionage and tradecraft that are showing through in the way the attacks work and the way the code is written. But everybody is being affected. And in fact, there's also evidence to suggest that cyber criminals are choosing individual verticals to target with some very specialist social engineering, very specialist email campaigns. We can call them campaigns because they effectively are marketing campaigns for cybercrime gangs. One good example is second-hand plant equipment or pre-owned plant equipment. Organizations that sell pre-owned plant equipment were being targeted late last year with something quite specific. And again, that turned out to be a piece of ransomware. The weak point in all of this has sadly become the inbox, and this is where most of the attacks are delivered. I said earlier on that it's very easy for someone to deliver an attack from anywhere in the world, even on a yacht somewhere in the Caribbean, and provided they've got an internet connection and a laptop, they can deliver an attack to any other individual in the world with an email. They don't have to be physically located where that person is. They don't have to learn any complex coding. They don't have to learn how to circumvent a vulnerability. What they'll do is they'll drop an email into your inbox. And what we saw with Locky in particular, and the way most ransomware is distributed these days, is through an email attachment. And the attachment will usually have a Word document or an Excel document with the email. And normally what you'll find is that there's a macro within that Office document, which is effectively what downloads the malware into your organization. That's pretty clever, but it's also, again, not new. Macro viruses were around a long, long time ago, and they sort of took a 15-year break. But what the cyber criminals worked out 3 or 4 years ago was that we're very used now to just clicking the enable content or the enable code button at the top of the page. That screenshot there is a screenshot of an actual threat. And you'll see that even inside the Word document, they're putting social engineering into that to persuade you that you need to enable the content or enable the macro to view the content of the Word document, which we know is nonsense. But when you're a flustered finance user at the end of a quarter, you're just clicking buttons all over the place, and a macro is not unusual to you, so it's very easy to become affected. Sadly, also, we've seen ransomware in social media. We've seen links in text messages which take you to watering hole attacks, which can encrypt an Android device. We've seen malvertising. If that's a new phrase to you, that's malicious advertising or advertising that delivers malware into your organization. That's done through legitimate websites as well. So you could be going to CNN.com, or you could be going to a website that serves ads. And if that website provider is subscribing to an ad service which has been compromised, malware can be delivered through the ads onto that page. That's also quite common. And lastly, but probably not the least effective, is actually on the network. One of the things ransomware is really good at is propagating around a network. And again, that's not something we've seen used to great effect for quite a while, but ransomware will use SMB shares to sniff out what sits around the machine it's currently sat on. And if it can spread itself using those SMB shares, it will. So very often when you see a ransomware attack like the San Francisco subway attack, all of their kiosks were taken offline. It's because they're all networked, and the ransomware detects other machines on the network and then just pushes itself out to all of those machines very quickly. You can't really turn that off. So that's why when we talk about outbreak control and propagation control, things like segmenting your network are obviously very important. Now, going back to your inbox, it is, as I said, the weakest point. desktop inboxes, Outlook, Gmail, Hotmail, even on your mobile devices, perhaps not so on iOS, but more so on Android. Though that is where the ransomware generally will come into your organization. And I guess it's like that because the cyber criminals have worked out that it's very easy to exploit weaknesses in the secure email gateway. And I've said many times before, I often talk to organizations who tell me they've updated their secure email gateway 2 years ago. And what's the problem? You know, we've got up-to-date software, up-to-date hardware. We're on 3-year refresh cycle. And then when you look at the way the threat has moved on in the past 2 months, you think, well, you've got to stay on top of this. 2 or 3 years ago is not good enough. The particular weaknesses within a secure email gateway relates to the way a lot of those solutions will scan macros, for example. So if you receive an Office document with a macro in the attachment, the secure email gateway may not be able to detect the fact that that macro then calls off to a remote website somewhere and downloads code. And thanks to Microsoft, the ways of obfuscating those download links inside a macro are numerous. So it's very easy for cyber criminals to hide that download inside the macro. So if you're just having your secure email gateway just scans for content and it just scans for fingerprinted or signaturable viruses, then it's not up to date. It's not good enough. We know, thanks to the Verizon Data Breach Investigations report that's published every year, that some 70 to 90% of attachments that are received by organizations are unique. And they're built that way because they're circumventing the signature scanning that goes on with classic antivirus engines. Also a weakness of desktop antivirus engines as well, I should point out. Now, there is something you can do with your secure email gateway. That's put in sandboxing. An attachment sandbox will effectively explode or run the attachment before it gets processed by the gateway and delivered to the user. So if that document contains a macro, it will run the macro and it will say, well, why is this macro calling off to a website in the Philippines? It doesn't need to. That's spurious behavior. We'll block it, we'll alert the administrator and stop that from reaching the end user's inbox. What we've seen very recently is, you remember I said Cerber is one of the most prevalent pieces of ransomware at the moment, partly because it does such a good job of staying ahead of the security community. So we always talk about an arms race, don't we, where we're always trying to run faster to keep up with the cyber criminals. Cerber does a really good job of that. One of the things we've seen Cerber doing is, in response to things like sandboxing, and the way attachments are scanned in secure email gateways, is to attach an attachment to an attachment. Now that might sound a shade complicated, but what I mean is that your user would receive an attachment, which would be a PDF file, for example, and attached to the PDF file would be a Word document, and in the Word document would be a malicious macro. So you can see how they're effectively working out how to get around sandboxing, how to get around attachment controls. They're working out new ways of hiding the download for the ransomware. Remember, none of this is signaturable content. That's the beauty of hiding the dropper for the malware in a macro, is that to your antivirus engine, it just looks like a macro. It doesn't look like a virus because there's no malware code that matches with a signature inside the macro. It's just a download of something from somewhere, and that's the actual malware content. So that's a pretty clever change. What we also is Locky will also perpetrate this attachment in attachment trick, and in fact it will attach the PDF to a spam message as well. So you're immediately suspicious anyway, but you think, well, it's got a PDF attached. Why does spammer send PDF? So you have a look, and then the Word document runs in the background, usually with a bit of social engineering to encourage you to run it, encourage you to enable the macro. Very often, as I mentioned, it's either an invoice or a courier message or a complaint, perhaps. Hotels are a great target for these guys because they'll send you a letter which is a complaint. We stayed at your hotel, insert hotel name here from some kind of mail merge they've bought from somewhere, and your customer services team just open up that file. Before you know it, they've been hit, which is a bit of a shame. As I mentioned, other threat vectors, we've seen SMS, social media, advertising on the network. One thing I forgot to mention was that malvertising isn't a threat that's going to go away anytime soon, so now's a good time to start thinking about blocking adverts. And in fact, this week we've seen Google announce that Chrome is going to start having an advert blocking capability built into it. Lots of different ad blocking technologies out there. And that's just one of the ways you can prepare yourself, but that's probably more useful at a local consumer level. As an organization, what do you do to prepare yourself? And you have to prepare yourself, because if the first time you find out about ransomware is when someone's complaining they've got a skull and crossbones on their desktop, that's not the learning curve you want to be on. You want to be building a plan right now, today, in fact this week. How do we prepare for this? What do we do? Well, first of all, patch everything. You should be patching absolutely everything as often as possible. I still today terrifyingly come across organizations that have an NT4 box somewhere chugging away, running a piece of bespoke code connected to the internet, but running a piece of bespoke code that they can't touch because it will break some function somewhere that someone relies on probably once a quarter, once a month. Now is not the time to be relying on things like bespoke code and out-of-date solutions. Also, actually, as a result of the Shadow Brokers release through all of Edward Snowden's work, patching your Windows infrastructure is vital right now. So go and patch everything. Don't ignore the patches, and also don't ignore all of the patches and the updates for things like browser plugins, Adobe Flash if you still use it. Make sure those will get patched. Every single plugin and app that runs on the desktop, make sure they're all patched all of the time. I can't stress that often enough. Also, think about losing things like local admin rights across the network. End users generally don't need local admin rights. The ability for an IT team to manage infrastructure these days is fantastic. An end user, when you remove their local admin rights, may grumble they can't change their screen saver every so often, but that's not the end of their world. The end of the world would come when they have local admin rights and something can exploit a vulnerability on their OS or in an application on their desktop because local admin rights exist. If you remove local admin rights, you're removing about 90% of all of the threats that affect a Windows machine. And also, don't just rely on desktop antivirus. I meet people very often who say two things. One is, oh, we have desktop antivirus, we'll be fine. And the other is, we run Macs, we'll be fine. Lovely, perfect, great. That bucket of sand you've got your head stuck in must be lovely and cool and exfoliating on your skin, but that's not going to protect you. As I mentioned earlier, when you've got a cybercrime gang who are earning millions and millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars from these attacks, they are finding ways around all of the desktop antivirus that they come across. And don't be fooled into thinking they don't know how it works. They buy it just like we do, and they reverse engineer it, and they work out where its weaknesses are, and they work out how to circumvent it. And what you'll see is, if you look at lots of ransomware in any detail, that many of them will identify desktop antivirus and either will disable it, even uninstall it in some cases, and install its own antivirus to protect that machine from being compromised by any other threat. So make sure you're not just reliant on desktop antivirus. Now, one of the most obvious ways to prepare yourself against this type of threat is backups. There are lots of people who say it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when you get attacked. I don't want to be that cynical, but what I do want to say is that backups are probably one of the most reliable, if not the most reliable, way of protecting yourself against ransomware. Yes, you have to have secure email gateway protection that does things like sandboxing. Yes, you have to have some sort of anomaly detection on the network, perhaps that's looking for outbreaks. Yes, perhaps have something a little bit more sophisticated on the desktop that's not just antivirus or basic vanilla antivirus. Backups are the most vital thing, because it's very simple to restore a backup, and what you don't want to be tricked into is getting into the situation where it's cheaper to pay the ransom than it is to restore from the backup, because you haven't got a good backup regime. When we talk about backups, there is something called the 3-2-1 backup rule. I won't go into that in too much detail, apart from to say that we're talking about 3 copies of a backup in 2 different types of media, and of course keep one of them off site. We'll go into that in a lot more detail slightly later on, which is why I won't cover it now. What I think is more important to cover now is to remind you that things like user awareness training are vital. Regular training of your users is vital. And I'm not just talking the standard security induction when they join plus a quarterly or 6-monthly security sheep dip. Tell them what the threat is this week. What's the thing to watch out for this week? Don't just email them as well. Tell them in different ways. Do a desk drop. Send them an SMS. Have someone walk the floor and tell people what the threat is right now. Watch out for this type of email, or watch out for that type of attachment. Think outside the box, because what you're trying to do is not just make users aware of the threat. We can all be aware. We're all aware of the speed limit, but a lot of people will transgress the speed limit for every once in a while. You have to understand the risk of falling for this attack, or you have to understand the risk of ignoring the advice you've been given, to you as an individual or as a user on the network, but also the risk as presented to the organization. So make sure you pay attention to the finance team and the HR team. If those guys are fully understand the risk, then the organization can be better protected, because as I mentioned earlier, the cost is significant. If the worst should come to the worst, what do you do? Well, you're going to have to recover at some point. The first you'll probably hear about it will be a phone call. Someone will say, I can't get access to my files. And you'll say, what do you mean? And they'll say, I've got a skull and crossbones on my desktop, or I've got a message telling me my files are encrypted. What have you done? And there's a countdown timer saying I have to pay someone. That's generally what will happen. So put the phone down, or walk away from your inbox. Go and find a quiet corner, a stairwell somewhere, have a panic. For 4 or 5 seconds, get the panic out of your system, be done with the panic. Now is not the time to be panicking. Take a deep breath, go back in, and then with a clear, calm head, try and work out what's going on. Panicking is only going to make it worse. You need to work out, or try and work out exactly where ground zero was. Where did the attack come in? You need to work out how is your network segmented. Can you start removing parts of the network from each other to allow users to remain in production, but also remove the threat on other parts of the network? So that's why you need to have a clear, calm head. Running around panicking, switching off machines, and generally causing a fire drill is not the way to solve this problem. If you do find ground zero and you want to forensically preserve any machine anywhere, don't do a graceful shutdown, just pull the power. The best way to forensically preserve a hard drive is just pull the power on it, because if you do shutdowns, you start altering things like timestamps. We can access the data on a hard drive even if you pull the power on it. And what you're trying to do is damage limitation. You're trying to contain ground zero. You're trying to work out where this came in, how fast it's spreading, where's it got to. Remember I said that ransomware can spread by SMB shares? Well, that's why you need to try and work out where it's gone. Once you've done that, you can start to think about cleaning the network, remove the ransomware. By all means, try and remove it. Try and clean the machine. The quickest way to do that, obviously, is restore from a known good backup. And good backup is the vital point here. Lots of organizations have restored from a backup which already contains the malware code. So within a few weeks, they're back having the devices re-encrypted. So make sure you're checking your backups regularly. If you, and I would advise going to law enforcement as well. If you can retain logs for law enforcement, that's good. Report the crime. You can do that in lots of different places. In many parts of the world, you will soon have to report the crime as well. So there'll be no choice. And then also go and remediate as well. So close the holes, run a debrief inside the organization. How could we have handled this better? Now, any classic incident has a debrief and a remediation plan afterwards. And this is no different, because this will appear like an outage to you. And in some ways, you'll behave just like you're suffering an outage. So learn from what happened and learn about the protections you have in place. And then, of course, lastly, do you pay the ransom? Well, I mentioned earlier, and Jay Peter mentioned at the beginning as well, that some ways it's easier and cheaper just to pay the ransom. Before you do, you should be aware of where the money goes. And I very briefly at the beginning said that it funds the most, or the darkest parts of humanity. And it does. This is money that's laundered back through criminal gangs. It funds terrorism, human trafficking, drug trafficking, arms trafficking, cybercrime, basically all of the things that you don't want to be involved with. And that's where maybe $1,000, $2,000 goes. And I do understand there may well be times where you've got absolutely no choice but to pay the ransom. The best example of that is things like family photos. Your laptop's been encrypted and you've got no backup of your family photos. If you can come to terms with funding those nasty bits of humanity, then okay, but don't pay the ransom as a first option. It should be your absolute last resort, and that's why backups are the most important. So I'm done. As J. Peter mentioned at the beginning, there will be the opportunity for questions at the end. We'll cover those. And what I'm going to do now is hand over to Rick to go into how Veeam can help you in a little bit more detail.
Well, cheers, and thank you for that, Orlando. Great intro. And I want to highlight one thing: paying the ransom, yes or no. And I'm going to give you a twist, Orlando. You know, I don't think it's a yes or a no question. I think it's actually pay now or pay later.
Sure.
And my thought is invest in an availability strategy, your backups, that can help you get out of that situation if/when that happens. And, you know, Veeam can help you with that for sure. But what I'm going to go through are some practical tips that actually anybody using any backup product can benefit from. So some of these things are actually free, like this first tip here, on using different credentials or special credentials for the backup storage and the backup job. Now, this is something any backup product should use. And ideally, first of all, we are doing backups. Let's make that assumption. And for those of you who are familiar with Veeam, you know we have products for VMware and Hyper-V backups, but did you know we also have products for Windows non-virtualized systems, so PCs, laptops, physical servers, Linux systems. That's available now, especially if you're doing stuff in the public cloud. Use different credentials. This is a very good tip. And I'll give you a data point that our technical support team every day helps customers out of this problem with ransomware. So different credentials is probably the single most effective tip to prevent ransomware impacting your actual backups. And trust me, that can happen too. So it's not just your primary data. When you think about if you have ransomware come into your environment at some level, you really have two decisions. One is a calculated amount of data loss via letting the ransom just take that data, that ransomware take that data and not do anything with it. A restore, which is presumably a restore point somewhere different from now, or paying the ransom. I mean, there's really no good option, but having this particular technique, no matter what backup software you use, is the single most effective bit. Then there's the next most effective bit, and that is something offline. Our product manager, Anton Gostev, likes to say air-gapped. And, you know, I used to I have a secret blog post I can never write now. It's called Top 5 Reasons I Hate Tape. And find me in a bar sometime, friends, and I'll tell you the story and the why I hate tape. But in this era, I gotta not publish that blog post. This is absolutely the best classic example. Offline storage with tape. When it's not being read from or written to, it is completely offline. And in the ransomware era, this is absolutely a mechanical design that is undisputably positive in regards to availability. And take it one step further is that the acquisition cost and portability of tape are pretty good. Now, I will, you know, raise my hand and kind of nod my head that every one of us have a story of how tape has let us down at some point in the past, and I'm no exception, hence that blog post. So I took a different approach here and identified what I'm calling some semi-offline options. So tape is completely offline, I get that. But, you know, when you look at what happens in the data center in particular, and ransomware is not just a PC problem, I should highlight that. Again, our technical support deals with it every day, and our current, like the bulk of our products are only in the data center. So this is definitely not just a PC or a phone problem. It can absolutely hit the data center as well, and that's, you know, as IT pros, it's not where you want to be. So here are some other mechanisms that you can work into your designs. You know, replicated virtual machines. This is a really good idea to get that extra level of resiliency and availability. The one thing I'll highlight here is using different frameworks, Hyper-V in particular. With Windows to Windows, it's, you know, you run a propagation risk, but with VMware, it's implicitly using a different couple credentials, but again, you can integrate Active Directory. So again, you want to think about your authentication frameworks. Primary storage snapshots, great mechanism for recovery. They're usually a different login, different authentication mechanism. So if you have an array that can do storage snapshots, it would be really good to have that as one additional layer of availability as a recovery technique. Now this Cloud Connect option, this is a very specific Veeam example, but a lot of different ways to leverage the cloud for your backup. It communicates with different APIs, different frameworks, different usernames, passwords. This is an additional way that might be able to hit your offsite element pretty good, and then rotating hard drives are pretty good. In fact, Orlando highlighted the family pictures. That's what I do. I use rotating hard drives at home for that. And then here's my third tip, is to leverage different file systems for your backup storage. I grew up being a Windows guy, but maybe I need a Linux system to hold just my backups with yet a different password and a different file system. If I had Linux and I'm mounting it as an SMB share, that's not really what I'm getting at. I'm talking about, okay, I'm running Windows for my applications, but I'm going to back them up, and maybe they're virtual machines, but I'm going to put it on a Linux system on an ext4 file system. Different file systems will help you block some of these propagations because they authenticate differently, how they read and interact with each other. It's a layer of, it's an obstacle for these ransomware applications to propagate. And when it comes to your backup, that's your last line of defense, and this is yet another angle that you can have that more available approach. Now, I talked about storage snapshots on primary storage, but I want to make you think a little bit about this one, taking storage snapshots on the backup storage. Now, this actually came to me out of some of our engineers in Europe who are really big about taking the old SAN that used to be the primary storage, and then when they buy the new SAN, the old SAN is where the backups go. Well, the old SAN still has a lot of capabilities, and one of them is storage snapshots. But a lot of times people simplify things for backup. I mean, I live in a boring part of the data center evangelizing backup software. But if you have storage systems that hold your backup storage and they're very capable, this is another area where you can have some additional resiliency in the ransomware era. And my fifth tip is really to master that 3-2-1-1 rule, and I'm going to explain what I mean by 3-2-1-1. So the 3-2-1 rule classically says that you should have 3 different copies of your data on 2 different media, with one of them being off-site. Now, this is a great rule, a very, very simple design that doesn't require any particular technology. In fact, it would apply to how you manage your photos. It would apply to how you manage your mission-critical applications as a business. Very, very versatile. And then also, it can give you protection against virtually any failure scenario. Now, I'm going to give you the 1 and the 0 to kind of take it to the next level. I would also advocate that one of them is not just off-site, but offline. Now, you can do both with something like tape, or the cloud could be an option for that too. And then I'll count it down to 0. The 3-2-1-0 rule is to have no errors after backup recoverability verification. Now, that is where it gets hard. Now, small, cheap plug for Veeam here is that Veeam has had automatic backup recovery verification for 7 years now, believe it or not. This is our 7th year that we've had our Sure Backup technology. What a great way to discover these things. And, Orlando talked about pulling the hard drive, right? Our Sure Backup verification technology actually powers up what you've backed up. So it's going to go through a startup sequence, and maybe, we don't have a documented example of Sure Backup catching ransomware, but having one more data point into what would happen if you used your backups might be helpful. But again, this 3-2-1-1 rule, 3-2-1-1-0, whatever you want to call it, this is an opportunity for a better availability experience in the ransomware era. Now, I would take my 6th tip is to having some visibility into any suspicious behavior. This can be from end to end. Doesn't have to be a data center example, but even just training, letting people know, like Orlando's examples of the threat. That's great. And then getting feedback of like, oh, I saw something like that yesterday. So that would be something that we need to look at. All types of visibility are really, really beneficial today. And specifically for visibility, one thing I will highlight that Veeam has done is we've introduced an alarm that indicates possible ransomware activity. If we see a big bump in CPU and bump of writes, like a spike abnormally, we can trigger an alert, right? Again, having that visibility earlier is more important than that phone call. And the important part here is that this is something that if you have a false positive, great, but if it catches it once, even better. And then my seventh practical tip is to let the backup copy job do the work for you. Having those different instances of your data doesn't mean you have to rework everything, but this is a Veeam example, but the Veeam backup copy job can take a backup of a Windows virtual machine that's Hyper-V and put it on a Linux file system, or it can take a VMware backup and put it on Windows file systems, right? This is a very easy way to meet this rule. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Jay Peter to field the questions.
Greetings again. Wow, that was, you know, you ever have like a really big meal and you just feel full afterwards? That's kind of how I'm feeling right now. I just feel full. That was great, guys. Really appreciate it. Due to time, we're not going to be able to answer all of the questions. And so as I said at the beginning, anyone who doesn't have a question answered during the presentation, we will certainly get back to you through email, whether it's a question for Orlando or Rick. Now, we do have a couple of questions, though, that we do have some time for. And this, I think this one's really for you, Rick. In your first example, your first tip, you talked about special credentials. And so there were a couple of questions that came in regarding that as far as what you mean by that. Do you mean different logins, different media types? Like, what exactly are you referring to?
As completely separated as possible. Maybe a domain account to like read virtual machines or read systems for backups. But then when I put my backups in this location, this is if it has to stay Windows to Windows, then I'm going to use a completely separate Windows username and a completely local SAM database, not even on a domain, and turn Windows Firewall on. So really a completely isolated, as much isolation as possible is what I mean by that. You don't want to let your backup account called serviceaccount.backup pick up your data and traverse your ransomware as well.
Oh, very good. Well, actually, that last sentence ties in nicely to one of the other questions that came in. One of the persons says, say, I have a Veeam offsite repository. How likely is it that ransomware can traverse that link to mess with offsite backups?
Well, we'd have to, when we say offsite repository, if it's a Cloud Connect backup repository, you're in really good shape because it's a totally different set of credentials, and it's not even like a operating system set of credentials. If it's a straight Veeam repository that's on your infrastructure sitting somewhere else, then we just want to make sure that the different account credentials are as different as possible. If domains are involved, no trusts at all between those forests, as many layers of abstraction would be the better design.
Very good, very good. This is a question that either Rick or Orlando might be able to answer. The person says, have you heard of ransomware which is logged into someone's third-party cloud backup account and deleted their backups from there as well? And the person says, it happened to me. Either one of you hear of that?
There is ransomware which will connect to cloud backups. Yes, deleting the backup, I'm not entirely sure, but that suggests that there is probably somebody controlling it who's got the credentials somehow and managed to get in there at the same time, probably through a phishing attack, perhaps. But connected cloud backups can be affected by ransomware too. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I would add that no platform is going to be immune to this, but where we put our backup data, we want to have as many isolated instances on it. So if I have my backups in a cloud and on a tape and on disk locally, and none of the frameworks and file systems of those three have anything in common except that they're my data, then that's what I can do right now to be as resilient as possible.
Oh, fantastic. Well, we've just hit the 1 hour mark. I just want to answer one question for folks because we got this question quite a bit, and that is, will this webinar be available afterwards? And the answer is yes. You will get provided with the copy of this ransomware webinar a few days afterwards. We're going to have the recording prepared, and you'll be able to access that recording. So no worries there. Well, I'd like to thank both of you. This has been wonderful. On behalf of both Conversational Geek and Veeam, we'd like to thank everyone for attending today. We hope that you found it both informative as well as enjoyable, and we look forward to seeing you again in a future webinar. Thanks, everyone.